The next HTML5 structural element that we want to take a look at is the section element. And this is an important element because it's typically the most common element. Now, before we go into the W3C's definition of the section element, I just want to point out inside of Dreamweaver that we have several different elements available within the structure section of the insert panel. We've already talked about the header element. We've also talked about the nav element. And each of these elements had very specific rules in terms of what type of content you should place within these elements. Other elements that we're going to be taking a look at will be aside, article, and footer. And like headers and navs, aside, articles, and footers have very specific rules that the content must follow in order for you to use these elements. The section element doesn't really have many rules except you need to have a thematic grouping of content. And what that means is that the content within the section should all be related to one another. So if you have content that's related to one another but doesn't fit within the rules of a footer, article, aside, nav, or header, well, then you should use a section element. For that reason, the section element is considered a more generic container, but you want to use that term generic cautiously. The section content still has to be content that relates to one another. It should be a grouping of content. It should be a complete thought, if you will. A generic container, like the div element, would be one that would be used if you don't have a grouping of content. For example, you may just have some visual element you need to add to the page. If that's the case, that visual element really wouldn't follow any of the rules of these other structural elements. Therefore, you would use a div. So it's important that you don't confuse the div element with the section element. The section element should still contain a grouping of content, but that grouping of content doesn't fall within the guidelines for these other HTML5 structural elements. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but if we come back to the web browser, and more specifically, we come back to the W3C's website, again, I'm looking at the spec author view, let's just go ahead and read the general definition of the section element. And it reads, the section element represents a generic section of a document or application. And the more important part of that description is the second sentence. A section in this context is a thematic grouping of content, typically with a heading. Again, it uses the word typically because it's not a rule that you need a heading inside of the section element. And it goes on to give some different types of examples. I would encourage you to read through this documentation a little bit if you want a deeper understanding of the section element. And it does note when you should use something like an article element over the section element, and we'll review that in greater detail when we talk about the article element. So if we look at the page that we're trying to create, we have this main banner area. And this main banner area really isn't going to contain information that belongs in a footer or a header or some other HTML5 structural element other than the section element. So that's what we're going to use to contain this information, which just happens to be an image. So if we come back into Dreamweaver, inside of Dreamweaver, what we want to do is make sure that we have a blinking cursor after the nav element. And more specifically, we want to make sure that it's after the header element as well. So if you put a blinking cursor here, you'll notice in the split view, our blinking cursor really isn't in the right location. We want it between the closing header and the closing div. Once you have your cursor positioned properly, at that point you can go ahead and insert a section element, and we're going to go ahead and give this an ID of main. Then we can go ahead and click OK. So again, all we're doing here is building out the structure. We'll add content in a little bit. If we look at the structure, it makes sense. I'll go into the code view so we can see exactly what's happening. We have our div element, which is going to contain all of our content. And inside of that div element, we have a header. In the header, we have a navigation system. And outside of the header, we have our first section. In the next movie, we'll go ahead and take a look at when you should use an article element.